Hey there, welcome back to U.S. History. This is Tuesday's lecture, so you should be watching this on March 31st. And we're going to pick up with Roman numeral 3 today, the Roaring Twenties. Very interesting time period in U.S. history. In your textbooks, this is on page 420. Before we do that, let's go ahead and look at what we've got planned for the week. Monday, you should have already watched that lecture, Prosperity and Materialism, and then today, the Roaring Twenties. So on Wednesday, April 1st, you are going to have a quiz that covers all of the lectures so far that we've done in chapter 21. So that would be lectures 6 through 8. And the notes all the way from the beginning of chapter 1 to the end of page 423, that stops with responses to declining morality. You should stop studying at that point. You might be thinking, Mr. Fuqua, you look very casual. I actually just got done mowing the lawn. I had to get outside, started mowing, so I'm sorry if I look awful and I'm hard to look at. You're just going to have to get over it. But it was a good time, mowing the lawn, listening to my favorite podcast, Verdict, with Ted Cruz. And of course, hopefully you know who Ted Cruz is, the senator of Texas, and we talked about his election last year in depth against Beto O'Rourke. But anyway, all right, so I'm just going to knock this one out here. So we're going to start on page 420 with the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties. So the Roaring Twenties is the nickname often given to the decade of the 1920s, and the reason being is because times were roaring. They were high-flying times. You had production at an all-time high. You had industry at an all-time high. You had material wealth being at an all-time high, and people living in utter decadence and extravagance, people trying to keep up with the Joneses. We see a lot of materialism come into effect, but we also see a lot of changes in the culture and philosophically and spiritually in the United States at this time. And so while we look at the Roaring Twenties as maybe a high-flying, fun time, that it was really a time of spiritual decline. And the reason being is because we begin to see people start to interpret right and wrong how they want to interpret it, instead of looking at the Bible and saying, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. And this is what we call in your book the new morality. And so many Americans began ditching these cultural and traditional norms, or what was the standard for what was right and wrong and kind of how you do things. And so you have a group of people, especially young people, who began to look at their lives and say, you know what? I know what my parents and grandparents, what kind of the standard of how you live is for them, but I'm going to live life how I want to live it. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to live in utter extravagance. And you have psychologists such as Sigmund Freud, very popular psychologist, saying, you know what? Give in to your inhibitions. Give in to what your nature is telling you to do. He said if you suppress your inner desires, then that's unhealthy. And so you have a lot of people who look at people like Sigmund Freud and their teachings and say, you know what, he's right. I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to live life how I want to live life. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to give in to all these desires that I have and not suppress them. And so what we have now is a group of society that begins to live in immorality. You have drunkenness become a huge popular thing, like at parties. Drunken parties, you have sexual immorality start to become popular. And so now we kind of move into this time where people, while material wealth is at an all-time high, the spiritual state of many Americans is at an all-time low. And so talking about one of those younger groups, we have women who began dressing differently and even acting differently. We call them flappers. And so they dressed in shorter skirts. If you look on page 421, you're going to see a picture of two women there. And I know it says they start wearing shorter skirts. You're going to look at that picture and you're going to say, that's like a modest dress that I wear now. And that may be the case. You just have to understand that the skirts that they're wearing during that time, that's considered to be a really short skirt. So these women began living in a lifestyle that was shocking to many of the older generations. So you need to know that those women were called flappers. Also, one thing that we can look at to get a good understanding of the Roaring Twenties is literature. Oftentimes, literature is a good indicator of what society believes and where society is at. And when we look at the literature of the age and the authors that were very popular during that time, such as Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, when you read their books, you begin to see that while people were enjoying the extravagant living that they partook in, deep down inside, they were empty. They were longing for something more. There was a lot of fatalistic endings and philosophies behind their writing, especially Ernest Hemingway. He wrote Old Man and the Sea, also wrote A Farewell to Arms, both of which I've read. And I like his writing style. It's kind of like short, simple sentences that he tells a story in. As a guy, I really like it because it's kind of short, sweet, to the point, tells it how it is. But at the end of a lot of his stories, it's just kind of like people who are looking for their meaning in life but come away empty at the end. Very depressing. Every time I've read a book, I enjoy the middle part of it, and then whenever I get to the end, after I finish the last page, I'm just like depressed. I don't even know what to say. But then you have F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote a famous book, you'll probably have heard of it, The Great Gatsby, which also kind of has a similar tone to it. A man who has everything, but deep down inside has nothing. All right, let's move on to the Prohibition. You should already know what amendment started Prohibition. That was the 18th Amendment. And you also need to know that Prohibition was a law that stated that the manufacturing, the transport, sale, and consumption of alcohol was declared illegal. Now, I guess the best way to describe this in today's terminology is if you look at the drug cartels, especially in Mexico and along the border here, southern border here in the U.S., what the cartel does with illegal drugs, that's kind of what began to happen with alcohol during the Prohibition. You have organized criminal groups, gangs, that began to look and see how much money they could make by selling alcohol. A lot of people, because alcohol was illegal, they weren't able to get their hands on it. A lot of people were willing to pay a pretty penny in order to get alcohol. And so these organized groups, this organized crime group, especially ones led, most famous outlaw or gangster was Al Capone, also known as Scarface. No relation to the movie. But anyway, Al Capone, he started this organized crime network with selling alcohol. And then you have other organized crime groups that start to rise into prominence. And when they begin selling in each other's territory, you have gang wars that result. The crime rate skyrocketed during Prohibition. The murder rate skyrocketed as well. And so crime actually went up during the Prohibition, leading many lawmakers in Washington to look at this and say, was it really even worth it? But before we move on, I also wanted to go over bootlegging. Bootlegging was the illegal creation and selling of alcohol. One funny fact is that NASCAR came from bootlegging. You had these bootleggers who, as they were transporting their alcohol, sometimes they were chased by police officers, mostly in the mountains in the southeast, like North Carolina, Tennessee, are some popular areas, Kentucky. And so these bootleggers, after Prohibition was repealed later on, under, I believe it was FDR, if I'm not mistaken, in 1933, we begin to see these bootleggers, once Prohibition was repealed, they had the skill of being able to drive cars at an extremely fast pace. And so they began racing one another for money, and that's how we ended up seeing the creation of NASCAR. Pretty interesting fact there. So you need to know what bootlegging is, and also you need to know the illegal or underground taverns that were created that sold alcohol. They were like these bars, secret bars, where people were able to drink. We call these speakeasies. And so, like it says in number 2, the law is very difficult to enforce. And the reason being is because not only is it hard to legislate morality, but whenever you have certain parts of the police force in certain towns, the police officers kind of turned a blind eye to the illegal goings on whenever it came to bootlegging and speakeasies, as long as they were able to partake in the goods as well. And so it was a very difficult law to enforce, and it ended up being repealed with the 21st Amendment later on. All right, Al Capone, I forgot to talk about what happened to him. Al Capone was actually not put away for murders, which many could be attributed to his name. He's not put away for his illegal dealings with alcohol. He was actually arrested and put into prison for tax evasion, not paying his taxes. FBI was able to find any little thing they could on him to put him away, and they were able to. All right, so that does it for today's lesson. Tomorrow you're going to have a quiz from the beginning of your notes to this point right here in Prohibition. So you need to study from the beginning all the way to Al Capone, and that's what your quiz will be over. I don't think I have any more announcements, so we're going to leave it at that. Good luck to you on your quiz tomorrow. Study hard, praying for you and your families to stay safe and healthy, and that'll be all for today. Take care.